I see a few of my students just walked in. Good to see you. And good evening to everyone else. And I'm curious to know, do we have any parents of children or young babies in the crowd? Oh, right, great, perfect. So ask any parent, ask any mother or father, and they will probably tell you that there's something about the cry of a newborn baby that's simply impossible to ignore. Parents are compelled to respond to these sounds, and of course their response has tremendous survival value for the helpless youngster. So this is also true for deer, as you will see in this video of a deer mother running as quickly as she can to the sound of a crying youngster.
Understood. Call about to begin.
This deer obviously feels the urgency contained in the infant's call. She has to respond immediately in order to keep her fawn from the jaws of a predator. Only in this case, she happens to be running to the sound of a fur seal infant, not a deer fawn. So what is going on? What is it about the cry of the sound of a cry that makes parents respond so powerfully to the sound of their own infant? Will the answer to that question help us understand cases in which a parent might respond to the cry of a completely different species? More broadly, how similar are emotional vocalizations such as cries across species, including humans? So distress vocalizations, commonly known as cries, are very similar across species. They're virtually universal across mammals. Infants will cry in the same behavioral context. We'll see this when they're separated from their mother or from another caregiver, when they are hungry, in pain, or when attacked by a predator, although hopefully that hasn't happened to any of your babies. Caregiver responses are also very similar across species. Mothers and other caregivers will approach when they hear the infant cry. And once the infant is reunited with the parent, it will usually stop crying. We also see very predictable neural and hormonal responses, changes in the mother's brain, both when she hears the infant cry and after she's reunited with the infant. Now, there are remarkable similarities in the sort of specific sound. We call it the acoustic structure of cries made by different species. For one thing, they all consist of a single burst of sound, although some species, like humans, seem to make a nearly constant series of these sounds. You can tell there's a lot of parents in this crowd. Another feature that's remarkably similar is something we call well-defined harmonic frequencies. These are the lines that are shown in this illustration of cries made by 5 different species. And what this means is when you have clearly defined harmonic frequencies, the pitch of the call is very clear, whether you hear the call as being low or very high. Some differences, though, between cries made by different species are that some species make cries that are longer in duration than others, and also some make cries that have a low pitch and others have a high pitch. So first you'll hear 3 cries made by different species that are similar in pitch. And now that was a bit sudden and loud. And now we'll have 2 that are very different in pitch. Okay. Now, as Julia said, most of the work in my lab has been with mule deer and white-tailed deer. A few years ago, my students and I were manipulating the different acoustic features in these cries to find out what was absolutely essential for a female to respond. It turned out that the frequency of the pitch was key to the response of both mule deer and white-tailed deer. We found that by manipulating the pitch, we found that females would approach to the cry of a fawn as long as the pitch was within 40 to 50% of the natural frequency of the fawns of that female's own species. So this was true for both white-tailed deer and mule deer. We then conducted playbacks between the two species. By manipulating the pitch, we found again that mule deer would respond to the cries of white-tailed fawns, and white-tailed mothers would respond to the cries of mule deer fawns as long as the pitch naturally fell or was manipulated to fall within that range of the fawns of the female's own species. Now, this was very interesting because white-tailed mothers will not normally respond to a mule deer cry because their cry is actually twice as high as that of a white-tailed fawn. So these results made me wonder. We had noticed these similarities in the cries of many species that are much more distant than white-tailed deer and mule deer. We know similarities in the cry of the marmots, fur seals, bats, humans, you name it. I began to wonder whether deer mothers might respond to the cries of these much more distant species, and when we're talking about evolution or ecology, as long as we controlled for variation in the pitch of the call. Now, this idea seemed very far-fetched for a few reasons. We didn't really think this would happen. For one, deer have been separated in terms of evolutionary history. They last shared a common ancestor with seals, domestic cats and dogs, and bats 60 to 80 million years ago. They last shared a common ancestor with marmots and with humans 80 to 100 million years ago. That's a very long time, even when it comes to evolution. Second, mammals live in all sorts of different habitats. We see animals like seals who swim, animals like bats that fly, and lots of mammals living in different habitats on the land. Usually we expect differences to arise as animals adapt to these different habitats. But nonetheless, we decided to run a few tests. So we played sounds by many different species. This included some hoofed animals, which aren't quite as distant from the deer, including some very large ones as well as small. But we really focused on the animals that were evolutionarily and ecologically distinct, including the marmots, fur seals, bats, domestic cats and dogs, and human babies. In some cases, the pitch of the call was similar to that of a deer fawn. But in other cases, the pitch was very low, like with the eland antelope, or very high, like the marmot you heard. So in these, we did a series of trials with the natural call, but we also did a second series once we had manipulated the pitch, keeping everything else the same. So the first one was the original marmot, and the second was the manipulated marmot, now in the range of the mule deer fawns. So to set up a trial, we would sit at particular vantage points to look for a subject. This work has all been done with free-ranging deer, so we usually start from about 1 kilometer or 500 meters away. This is a student, Cora, who's been actively involved for quite a few years now, and looking for a subject. She will remain at this location throughout the trial to observe. Another student, in this case it's Megan, sets up the speaker, trying to stay hidden from the subject, and then she has to crawl away to get to a safe location. Once the trial begins, we record whether or not the female moved to the speaker, and then how close they get to the speaker. So for the results, I will show you some clips of different trials, starting with the original very low voice of an eland calf. She's alert. She does not approach. Now another eland calf with the pitch raised. And she's off. She had about 300 meters to travel, so we had to cut down the video. She gets there, and then another 7. Oh, wait. Yeah. She's at the speaker. The cry of a human baby. You're laughing. Go on. So, We also played a series of control sounds that had the same pitch, to make sure it wasn't just the pitch of the call. In these, the females alerted but did not approach. So this included bird songs and other manipulations of sound. So earlier I showed you that mule deer females, as well as whitetails, will respond strongly as long as the pitch of a cry falls within 40 to 50% of the fawns of that species. We see the same trend when we overlay the results for all the different species, the response of deer to all the different species. So this confirmed that the pitch of the call is absolutely essential to generate a response by females. But remember that the pitch alone was not sufficient. We saw that from all the control trials. So this reveals that there's something else about the cry that is shared across the cries of all the different species that's absolutely essential for females to respond to this sound. Now this reveals a remarkable commonality in a form of emotional communication that's absolutely vital not only to deer and other mammals, but also humans, one of the other mammals. As humans, we often form relationships with members of other species. We tend to just picture a little lost bear cub, a little deer fawn, wandering about aimlessly crying, right? We especially feel for the young. This really tugs at our heartstrings. But of course, humans are special. Our empathy is special, aren't we? Well, it turns out that domestic dogs are acutely sensitive to the cries and also other emotional vocalizations of humans. It's been shown that the exact same parts of their brains light up using MRIs when they hear the sounds made by humans, as happens in a human's brain. So this mutual understanding between dogs and humans is usually attributed to their long period of association, which extends back about 30 to 40,000 years. Now, our finding that deer mothers are responding to the cries of newborn infants from which they've been separated for 60 to 100 million years, depending on the species, points to a different explanation for why a parent from one species might respond to the cry of another. It tells us that unique capacity for human empathy is not necessary. It tells us that a long period of association, such as we have between dogs and humans, is also not necessary. Instead, it suggests that there's a shared sensitivity that reaches much further back in time, probably 100 million years, if not longer. By now, some of you may be dewy-eyed at the prospect that these deer mothers are as empathic as many humans you may know. Our results do suggest that non-human animals such as deer can be sensitive to the acoustic cues associated with an infant, but whether or not we should be calling this empathy is really a question for another day and for someone else to address. On a lighter note, these results might give a glimpse into mechanisms underlying those weird and wonderful relationships that abound on the internet. One of my favorite cases is this lioness from Samburu who has adopted newborn antelope. At least it was 3 times. I think she's up to 6 now. She whisked the antelope away from the unfortunate mother, and she shows all aspects of maternal care, apart from not being able to nurse it. But this doesn't usually end well because she's a large cat. She eventually falls asleep. You know how cats like to sleep. And another lion who feels less motherly comes along. Down the road, there's many applications of this research to both human and animal health and welfare. What's most exciting to me is that we can really use the same principles. One application includes the use of specific features of the sound of a cry to diagnose health conditions. This is a field that's underdeveloped for humans and virtually untouched for animals. This includes interventions to facilitate caregiver-infant relationships in cases in which an atypical cry elicits neglectful care or even abusive care. And it also includes many forms of animal-assisted therapy that can be invaluable for both humans as well as animals. For example, children with autism really benefit by having therapy animals, but they're also very sensitive to sound, so it could be particularly important to identify an animal that would be a good match for this person. I think a great application is also with orphaned animals. You can find appropriate foster caregiver at a shelter or a wildlife rehab center. So characteristics that distinguish humans from other animals have become blurred in recent decades. As we learn more about the behavior and the emotions of animals, we start to value them more. This affects what we consider to be humane treatment and even raises questions about rights. Often this change occurs as we start to pull animals into our own circle. We view them as becoming more human. So today I have highlighted another commonality between humans and other animals, but I don't encourage you to view them as being more human. Instead, I suggest we flip this around. I encourage you to consider that many of the characteristics that we value the most in ourselves are actually characteristics that originated with other animals and that we still share. Thank you.